competition. The casting of votes for our photo and reels competition will be closed right after the keynote speech 1 session. Support your most favorite photo and reels to be the favorite winner of the competition.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to listen to our first keynote speech on a synergistic food system for nutrition, agriculture, and environmental sustainability. And this session will be delivered virtually by Dr. Lawrence Haddad from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. But before we listen to the speech, allow us to introduce our speaker first. Dr. Haddad is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition's Executive Director since 2016. Dr. Haddad was one of the drivers behind the initiative on climate and nutrition at COP27 and 28. And prior to GAIN, Dr. Haddad worked in research-based entities, Global Nutrition Report, the Institute of Development Studies, the International Food Policy Research Institute, the UK Steering Committee of the High-Level Panel of Experts of the UN Committee on World Food Security, as well as the UK and Ireland's Development Studies Association. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let us virtually welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Lawrence Haddad. Dr. Haddad, are you already with us? Are we audible?
Yes.
Thank you. You may take over the session.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very clear.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to the SEAMEO International Conference on Food and Nutrition. This is the second one. It's a big honor for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to talk to you today about climate and nutrition. There are lots of conceptual links, but what are the operational links? And I'm going to talk to you about an initiative that we are a part of at GAIN with FAO, WHO, Scaling Up Nutrition, and UNEP, called the Initiative on Climate and Nutrition. Will you click the next slide for me, please? So this is my outline. Why do we even need to bother with joint action on climate and nutrition? How connected are these two worlds currently? What are the opportunities for joint action? Let's show you that should be the performance of Indonesia. My apologies. Actions that can make a difference, and then understanding the trade-offs. Next, please. So the first slide really says climate and nutrition is a way off. Both ambitions for both are way off, but we're not exploiting the synergies for change. So we know that nutrition action needs to scale up much more quickly than it is. Stunting is still a massive problem. Wasting, anemia, and obesity, overweight, diabetes are rising rapidly. The other ones are not decreasing fast enough. We know that climate action is very slow as well. If you look at that top right report, broken record, greenhouse gases need to get from 57.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents to 32 by 2030 for compliance with the 1.5 degree target set in Paris. That's a huge drop in a 5-year period, which we will miss probably. If you look at the report in the bottom right-hand corner, the number of people unable to afford a healthy diet, 3 billion people and increasing, says the SOFI 2023 report. And that means, but are we missing opportunities? Is nutrition missing opportunities in the climate space to accelerate nutrition? And is climate missing opportunities in the food and nutrition space to accelerate climate actions? Next, please. So conceptually, we know that these two worlds are very strongly linked. If you think about nutrition to climate, what we eat matters for our nutrition, but it also matters deeply for greenhouse gas emissions. Healthier diets tend to be lower in animal source foods, certainly for everyone except the most vulnerable nutritionally, and that means lower greenhouse gases. We know that more diverse diets tend to rely on more diverse local production, and that's good for resilience to climate shocks. And we know that any food loss is a nutrient loss, because the most perishable foods tend to be the most nutritious. And but it's also an emissions loss. Those foods were produced, they generated emissions, but we can't consume them because they've been lost. So it's wasted emissions. But it's also on the adaptation side, especially going from climate to nutrition. We know that climate is affecting food yields. They're lower. That means lower nutritious food availability. We know that high CO2 levels are putting pressure on the micronutrient density in staple crops. We know that increasingly irregular and extreme seasonality has big effects on birth weight. We know that high temperatures affect stunting. We don't quite know the mechanism, but the associations are very strong. And we know that high temperatures and high levels of rainfall lead to lots of unsafe food, which is really bad for nutrition, especially for under twos. Next, please. So these two worlds are very linked. Next, please. But the picture is even more complicated than that. And next, please. And I just wanted to show you a slightly more elaborate link between climate change and nutrition. I'm not going to dwell on this, but there are other links other than the ones I summarized in the previous slide. And I think much as we in the nutrition community have that UNICEF framework of nutrition sort of burned into our minds, we need to begin thinking very carefully about these kind of frameworks that link climate and nutrition through diet quality on the left, but also through human health on the right. Next, please. So the ICANN report, the ICANN initiative, generated 2 reports in 2023, about a year ago. One was the green one is looking at what actions can provide win-wins in the nutrition and climate space. And I'm talking about things like reducing food loss and food waste, for example. But the really important gap in our knowledge was, what are the opportunities at the country level to implement the various win-wins? And this is the blue report on the right, which we call the baseline report. And I want to share with you a few results from that baseline report. Next, please. So what the baseline report did is it went through 13 of these indicators, and it said, let's go through each of these documents. Each one of these indicators is basically a set of documents. Let's go through these documents and let's look at how integrated climate and nutrition are in the documents. So we had a scale of 1 to 4. 1 means no integration whatsoever. 4 means integration with an action plan and ideas about how to fund it. And then levels 2 and 3 are in between. Levels 1, no integration. Level 4, high integration. And we went through all of the documents in this list for all of the countries that we could find the documents for. Next, please. And we used machine learning to go through the documents. And these are the 4 levels I mentioned. Level 1, no intentional connectedness. Level 4, a real commitment to mobilizing resources with a distinct plan to take climate nutrition forward at the same time. And level 2 and level 3 are in between. Next, please. So what were the results? Next, please. So NDCs and NAPs, these are 2 important climate documents. NDCs are nationally determined contributions, and they focus on plans to reduce emissions. And then NAPs are plans to adapt to climate change. So one is about mitigation, how do we reduce emissions? The other one is how do we adapt to high levels of emissions? And on the NDCs, we found 166 of these from 166 countries. And as you can see, very few of them have a high level of integration. Only 2% of the 166 NDCs were high linked. For the NEPs, it was better because we only found 43 national adaptation plans, and they tend to be produced by countries that are most heavily affected and least able to adapt to climate change. And of those countries, food and nutrition, especially agriculture, is a big part of their economies. So we expect to see quite a high level of integration between climate and nutrition in the NAPs, and we do. We see 16% of them, the green bar, have a high level of integration. This is the top right. But still, more than, I think that's, 60% of them have either level 1 or level 2, which is very low levels of integration. So even in the NAPs, there could be a lot more integration. Next, please. We also did the same for national nutrition plans. So the slide before was climate plans. Now let's look at nutrition plans. So the Sun Movement shared with us 50 national nutrition plans from 50 different countries, and we went through those. And again, about half of them had a pretty high level of integration, either level 4 or level 3. So you add those two together, you get 50%. But 50% of them had a low level of integration, level 1 or level 2. Next, please. We looked at the Global Nutrition Report commitments. The Global Nutrition Report gathers the commitments from each of the Nutrition for Growth summits. There was one in 2021 in Japan, and it looked at those commitments and found 95% of the commitments made by countries, businesses, and NGOs and donors. 95% of them had no connection between climate and nutrition. So we were a bit surprised by this, and I very much hope the Paris Nutrition for Growth Summit coming up in March of next year does much better than this. Please. So then we went through, so those were plans and commitments. Then we looked at policies. So we looked at food procurement, public food procurement. This is governments at the national, state, and local levels buy lots of food. They buy food for their schools, their health clinics, for their social protection programs, for their prison systems. There's a lot of institutionalized food that is procured by governments. And we went through 93 policies from 93 different countries, and we looked at whether they consider climate in the food they procure. So do they consider how many emissions are generated by the food they're procuring? And we found, again, very low levels of integration between the kind of food that is procured for schools, health clinics, social protection programs. Very little consideration given to the environmental or the climate consequences of the foods that are procured. And I know Indonesia is embarking on a very serious and ambitious school feeding program scale up, and I very much hope that climate considerations are one of the considerations that are come into play when food is being procured for that school meals scale up. Next, please. We looked at integrating climate into food procurement policies. This is the previous slide, but broken down by region. And it's kind of interesting that Asia and the Pacific do the least well in integrating climate into food procurement. Even Africa, we only have 8 procurement policies, but a quarter of those actually do build in climate considerations into their food procurement. Western Europe tends to do the best, but Latin America and the Caribbean do well. But in Asia and the Pacific, of the 30 plans we got, only 3% of those 30 plans had anything to do with climate considerations when they were purchasing food. Next, please. We then looked at food-based dietary guidelines, because these are important guides for consumers, but also increasingly for public policy. And then we looked at food-based dietary guidelines for 70 different countries, and did the same analysis and found that over 50% of them had no connection between climate and nutrition. Encouragingly, 11% of them did have a high level of integration of climate and nutrition, so that's good. That's something to build on. And 26% of them had some intention to connect climate. So again, that's something to build on, but real scope for improvement there. Next, please. We looked at finance, so we looked at strategies, plans, policies, guidelines, but we also looked at finance. We looked at the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund spends a huge amount of money on projects to governments that are intended to either be climate mitigating or climate adapting. And we looked at for all funding for all projects in 2022, and we found only 3% of the projects in 2022 for the Green Climate Fund, and these are billions of dollars. Only 3% of them had any distinct plans to take action to connect nutrition and climate. Again, now we're working with the Green Climate Fund to see if we can change those numbers for 25, 26, 27. But even if we could direct a little bit of money, a little bit more money from the Green Climate Fund towards nutrition, that would have a big impact on nutrition, but also we would argue it would have a big impact on climate, because if you think about it, most of the climate action focuses at the moment on the energy sector and the transport sector, but we know that food systems are responsible for a third of all emissions. So if you're looking for increasing opportunities to reduce emissions, the climate champions need to look in the food space. And I would say specifically in the nutrition food space, because the most perishable foods tend to be the fresh foods, which tend to be the most nutrient dense. Next, please. We did the same thing for official development aid, and we looked at this is all I think it's bilateral aid. No, it's multilateral and bilateral aid. And we looked at the total overseas development assistance finance for climate mitigation and adaptation over those 3 years, from 2019 to 2021. So I'm looking at the big circle on the left, nearly 300 billion. Of the 300 billion, 31 billion mention nutrition sensitivities, specific foods or diets, and then of that 3 billion, only 3.6 billion explicitly mention nutrition. So again, a big scope for 1% of the climate finance for mitigation and adaptation over the last the 3 years from 2019 to 2021. Only 1% of those mention nutrition explicitly. Next, please. We also looked at the private sector, and it's difficult to look at the private sector because there isn't much data around. But we found the WBA. This is the World Benchmarking Alliance. It's a non-profit organization that looks at 350 companies around the world who focus on food and agriculture. And we looked at the World Benchmarking Alliance ranks companies on do they do well on sustainability, and do they do well on nutrition. So we simply cross-referenced those two things and said which companies, how many of the 350 companies score highly on nutrition and score highly on sustainability. In fact, none of them scored highly on nutrition and on sustainability. And 72% of the companies had at the level one, very low levels of integration between climate and nutrition. So again, the private sector can do much better. They seem to pick one or the other, but not both. It's not very clear to me why. But again, that's something we can work on with the big food companies, the big food and ag companies. Next, please. I wanted to just quickly show you the results for Indonesia, because we have the results for every country. And I showed these results to the GAIN Indonesia team, and they said, Lawrence, these results are already out of date, so that's good. The results are better than are portrayed here. These are these results based on the documents we could obtain in the second half of 2023. So maybe there's been a lot of updates since then. But again, it shows potential for improving the integration between climate and nutrition in public procurement, in food-based dietary guidelines, in nationally determined contribution plans, and in national nutrition plans. And there is an NAP, I understand now, and I haven't looked at it yet, but I'd be interested to look at it. But these kind of results are intended to be a starting point for discussion with governments and other stakeholders about how can we do better to integrate climate and nutrition, and I think most importantly why we would want to do that. It's not always obvious to governments, so I think this is a good way of beginning a conversation. Next, please. We did this for all the countries. We did this for all the countries that GAIN has offices in. These are all the countries. And you can see that some of the countries do really well. Bangladesh is, very flood prone, big delta in Bangladesh. And so they are very focused on adaptation to climate change. And you can see that their national adaptation plans and their national nutrition plans are very strong on cross-referencing climate and nutrition, but even they have some challenges around food-based dietary guidelines. In Ethiopia, the nutrition community is very switched on to climate, but the climate community is not very switched on to nutrition. You can see that the nationally defined contribution, the national adaptation plan, doesn't score very well when it comes to nutrition, but the national nutrition plans and the food-based dietary guidelines do really well when it comes to climate. Next, please. So, what are some of the interventions to address post-climate and nutrition? And I think I've mentioned some of them. They're all very context specific, of course, but a general move towards healthier diets, more diverse diets, more plant-based diets, except for those with very, very high nutrient requirements, such as very young infants and adolescent girls. That's good for climate mitigation. Reducing food loss and waste is good because it means that we don't waste the emissions that are generated by producing, transporting, and processing these foods. We could scale up things like biofortified crops, because if staple crops are going to have fewer and fewer nutrients such as zinc and iron and retinol in them in the future, biofortified crops are conventionally bred crops that are higher in those nutrients. Large-scale fortification is a very inexpensive way of adding micronutrients to staple foods. Many countries are not fully exploiting the opportunities for fortification. I think we need to improve animal welfare. Why do I say that? Because animal mortality is very high in many countries. And again, if an animal dies before it can be used for human consumption, then again, all the emissions that animal generates are essentially wasted. Of course, you also want to improve animal welfare for its own sake as well. Diversifying cropping practices is good. Monocultures are generally not good for biodiversity. They're not good for nutrition usually, and they're very good for they're not very good for resilience to any kinds of shocks. So diversify cropping practices whenever possible, and then choose food value chains. If you're going to scale up and develop food value chains, find the foods that are high in nutrients but lower in emissions. And we're doing this again. We've done this in Indonesia, for example, with our Indonesian partners, and tempeh is the food that is very high in nutrients but lower in emissions. Next, please. We need to know the trade-offs if we're going to address climate and nutrition. It's easy to say, let's do them both at the same time, but there are trade-offs. Next, please. And this is something from The Economist magazine. If any of you read it, this is something from last year. The Economist, they call it somewhat humorously the banana index. But it says really most people look at emissions and they divide it by the number of calories produced. So you can see rice on the top panel, rice on the top right, generates quite a few emissions for the calories produced. You can look at salmon. Salmon produces a lot of emissions for the calories produced. But the economists said, actually, you should not look at emissions over calories. You should look at emissions over protein. So, because they said calories is just one very crude way of measuring the nutritional value of food. Better to look at proteins. So when they rerun the analysis on the top panel and they rerun it for the bottom panel, you can see that now salmon moves from being a high emissions per calorie food to a low emissions a low emissions per unit of protein. That's because salmon is very high in protein relative to some of these other foods. There's not much you can do for beef burgers. They're always going to be high emissions, no matter what the denominator is. Next, please. But again, we've been doing something beyond protein and beyond climate. So the Economist metric is emissions per unit of protein. We're saying actually protein is not a very good way of capturing the full value of the full nutrition value of a food. So we've developed something called the nutritional value of food, which captures calories, proteins, micronutrients, and also captures things like trans fats, high salt, high sugar. And then we say it's not enough to just look at emissions. You need to look at all the environmental impacts. So we use life cycle analysis for the environment. And when you look at life cycle analysis per unit of nutritious food, you get a very different ranking. This is a ranking from Bangladesh that we did. And you can see that beef has very high environmental footprint per nutritional value. Even though beef has a lot of micronutrients in it, a lot of protein, it still has environmental footprint per unit of nutritional value. But things like Ilish fish in Bangladesh have a very low environmental impact per unit of nutritional value. So the value chains that we at GAIN are focusing on in Bangladesh will be at the bottom of this graph because they have high nutritional value and they have a low environmental footprint. And this is from a journal article that's being reviewed at Nature Food at the moment by my colleagues Ty Beal and Flaminia Ortenzi. Next, please. So my summary, why is joint action on climate and nutrition feasible and desirable? Well, it's feasible and desirable because climate affects nutrition and nutrition affects climate, and neither of them are scaling up fast enough on their own. How connected are they at the moment? There's pretty weak connection in the policies, strategies, plans, and financing that I shared with you. That's the bad news. The good news is that there are many opportunities for joint action. That's whenever something is low, it's because usually not because we haven't tried. So there's plenty of opportunities to try to integrate these two in a very practical way. So for example, many countries are revising their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, for COP30 in Brazil in just over a year's time. We are trying to work with SUN to make sure that the SUN coordinators in the SUN countries are part of those conversations so they can build nutrition into the NDCs. It's not easy because the climate world and the nutrition world speak very different languages, have very different cultures. But if we can find 10 of those 50 countries that are able to do that, that's a start. The performance of Indonesia, lots of scope to integrate climate in nutrition and nutrition in climate in Indonesia, even though some of my data in the October 2023 report are out of date. There are many actions that can make a difference. I've shared them with you. They're well known. We know how to reduce food loss and food waste. We know how to We know how to develop SBCC campaigns that shift people towards healthier diets. But we do need to understand the trade-offs, and so we need better metrics. We don't have very good metrics for understanding which foods are high in nutrient value, low in environmental footprint. And I think that's my last slide, colleagues. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence Haddad, for the very insightful keynote speech. And now, this officially marks the end of our first day of International Conference on Food and Nutrition. We thank all the speakers, moderators, presenters during the oral, poster, and marketplace sessions, exhibitors, and all the rest of the participants for your engagement that made the first day of our conference exciting and insightful.
We also would like to remind that the voting for photo essays and reels competition is officially closed. We will be announcing the favorite winner by tomorrow. We would like to thank SEAMEO Siarka and SEAMEO Biotrope as our co-organizer partners, and we also would like to extend our gratitude towards our supporting partners, IMU University, Monash University Indonesia, Universitas Mataram, Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta, Food Bank Bandung, Action Against Stunting Hub for their abundant support in this event.
Before we leave in the conference venue, allow us to remind you about tomorrow's agenda. We will open the registration at 8 a.m. and the poster presentation session 3 will start at 8:30 a.m. by tomorrow.